All right. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this week's community call where we're going over Parkinson's and its correlation to Iboga. In essence, we're going to be talking about how Iboga is a potential or theoretical treatment for Parkinson's. Just a little CYA for us. This is not meant to be medical advice. Always consult a medical professional. This is simply us just reviewing some research that we've come across on some of the effects Iboga has. Ibogaine has and how that correlates to some of the specific causes of the Parkinson's symptoms. For those who don't know me, my name is Troy, one of the co-founders along with my wife of Written Wisdom. And I'm in a clinical psychology program right now for a doctoral program. And so very interesting fascination with the workings of the brain and especially how these different plant medicines, psychedelics, and theogens, plant teachers, whatever you want to call them, interact and intersect. So that's what this is going to be going into today, sort of all the neuroscience and some of the metaphysical as well. We'll outline, we'll go over some key definitions, some symptoms, some causes, some risk factors, diagnosis, and some treatments as well. Potential treatments, you could say. So the first thing is, what is Parkinson's? It's a progressive neurological disorder that affects the brain's ability to control movement and coordination due to the gradual loss of dopamine producing neurons. So just to recap, um, it's due to the loss of the dopamine producing neurons. And we're going to talk about that in great detail. But essentially, Parkinson's is a way to name a set of symptoms associated with what happens when these dopamine producing neurons are lost. And two famous people you can think of, or you might think of, are Muhammad Ali and Michael J. Fox. Especially Muhammad Ali's case, if you ever watched videos of his fights and then seeing him in his later years, it really shows you what Parkinson's is and what it does at its core. Some prevalence facts I think are important to review. The first is that there are about 8.5 million people living across the world with Parkinson's, and that's doubled in the last 25 years. And anytime you see numbers jumping up like this um, in recent years, you know that there are some sort of environmental factors sort of at play here. And when you see 330 deaths a year in 2019, which is a 100% increase since 2020, you can tell there's a really rapid growth rate. And so there's obviously something underneath affecting the global population here. When we look down or scale down to the USA, we see there's 90 people diagnosed, 90,000, excuse me, diagnosed each year. That was in 2022, which is a 50% increase from previous estimates. So that just shows again, like what's going on here. And then approximately 1 million people living with Parkinson's. And as we are, sorry, the motorcycle guy just cruised by. As we'll discuss in a little bit, there is, if there's 1 million people living with Parkinson's, there's no cure. It sort of speaks to the volume of how important it is for us to investigate potential treatments. Next is one thing is to remember is that there are different types of Parkinson's. There's idiopathic, early onset, familial, secondary, and atypical. Early onset and familial are very similar to one another. They're usually through genetic mutations and happen at an early age. Idiopathic, which is the most common, is usually for people above 60 years old. Secondary sort of speaks to the prevalence we're seeing out there, the results from external factors. For me, again, I said this before, but Parkinson's is more so a way to label a collective set of symptoms. And these symptoms could be from a variety of reasons or causes. And so we see here there's medication is one, toxins, drugs, head trauma. These are often reversible. And then there's atypical. And atypical is when there's diverse neurodegenerative conditions at play, like MSA, DSP, CBD. MSA is multiple systems atrophy. It's when you have widespread nervous system damage. PSP is progressive supranuclear palsy. That one specifically is when you have degeneration in specific brain regions. And then CBD is cortical, forgot the name of that. Cortical basal degeneration. There you go. Asymmetrical brain atrophy. So it's when you have atrophy on one side of the brain and not the other. I mean, we're going to talk about this atypical one a little later when we get into the research of Iboga. So if Parkinson's is related to the sort of the death of the dopamine producing neurons, then it begs the question, what exactly is dopamine? And before I say anything, there's a really beautiful book called The Molecule of More. If you're ever interested, it goes really into dopamine and the reward system. But dopamine's primary function, I would say one of them is motor control. And it regulates the motor functions by transmitting signals in the brain, motor pathways, ensuring smooth and coordinated movements. That's why when you see someone like Muhammad Ali and he's twitching, that's part of the motor control function being lost. Cognitive functions, addictive mechanisms, people all know about that. The reward and motivation, this is central to the brain's reward system. If you read that molecule more, it really dives into this specific category of what Parkinson's, or excuse me, what dopamine is about right here. Hormonal regulation, mood regulation, and sleep and wakefulness. So you see that it's a very critical aspect of our daily lives and our functioning. Simple things we take for granted, like being able to pick something up and hold it in our hand, when those things start to go away, you really start to sort of honor and hold the beautiful aspects of life that you have just from having your body under your own control. Some risk factors associated with it, pesticide exposure. We talked about the genetic factors. Being male, it's one that I wasn't really aware of, and then being over 50 years old. So these are just a few of the risk factors. And some of the main symptoms: memory problems, tremors, slow movement, reduced balance, rigidity, and depression. Um, this rigidity one is going to be very interesting when we come to the metaphysical properties a little bit later on those presentations. So just kind of keep this one in mind. The rest of them, you all sort of can identify these pretty well when you think of someone with Parkinson's, like Michael J. Fox or Muhammad Ali. So, in terms of the neurochemical causes, there's a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And this is down in the basal ganglia, which is part of that deeper limbic part of the brain. These are the first parts of the brain that develop and mature. What's actually happening is the nerve cells in this area are degenerating. And because they're responsible for producing dopamine, the dopamine production then depletes. And when the dopamine production depletes, you can no longer have the functions that dopamine carries out in the body. So it's a cascading effect. And that's what causes what we call Parkinson's, which again is a name for a set of symptoms. And so, to understand this a little better, I think it's important that we take a moment to understand exactly how our neurons work and function in our body. So, if you look up here, we'll just go through the anatomy real briefly, and I'll try to keep this as simple as possible. But you have this neuron. This is the entire neuron over here, okay? You have a nucleus, you have an axon, which you think of as like the tail, and then it comes down and it branches off into these little axon terminals, which then connects, if you can see here, it's sort of lighted out, and it connects to the next axon terminal, which then, like right here, would feed into another neuron, right? So this is sort of how we communicate through the body, through these neurons. So what really happens is a chemical signal touches these axon terminals, and that sends a message to this nucleus. That nucleus then sends an electrical impulse down the axon body. It travels all the way down to the very end to these terminals. And right here is what we're looking at in the large view. You have this thing called a presynaptic cell or a postsynaptic cell. You can also call it a presynaptic neuron or a postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron is the one that's taking the electrical impulse. Once it gets to the end, this electrical impulse sends a chemical message across. These are those neurotransmitters. So imagine these little balls is dopamine. So the electrical impulse travels all the way down, and it's going to signal the dopamine to travel through this synapse here into this post neuronal synapse. And it's going to receive that. Oh, excuse me. Let me go back. So that's sort of how we communicate. So remember, we all know we're biochemical organisms, but we are as much electrical as we are biochemical. There's a really beautiful book called The Electric Body by Eileen McCusick. It goes into all this really awesome stuff about how we are really these electric beings. One thing I really want to mention here, we're going to come back to later, is around your axon body, you have these things called myelin. And myelin work to insulate the electrical impulse that travels down, right? So if an electrical impulse sends down, if there is no myelination, that impulse will be lost to the environment and it will never make it to the end down here. Because it never makes it to the end, no dopamine will be produced. And that means no dopamine will be received by the next postsynaptic neuron. And that message, that response, that function won't occur. So this myelination is very, very, very important. And so what we're seeing here in Parkinson's specifically is this entire process in its own way is degenerating, it's dying. And what's happening is we're not producing dopamine down here and it's not getting absorbed by the next neuron. So if you think about it, something like telling yourself to pick up a pencil, what's happening is a cascading effect from neuron to neuron down to your hand, and you're picking it back up. Well, if those messages aren't making its way down to your hand, guess what you can't do? You can't move your arm or you can't control it. That's where the shaking comes in. So this is the mechanism behind Parkinson's at its core, right? That degeneration of this neuron, the electrical impulse either isn't making it to the end because the myelination is gone, or it's making it to the end. And because it's degenerating, it's not producing dopamine down here, or dopamine's not being absorbed on the other side. That's pretty much the root cause of Parkinson's. Sorry, more of the effect. So the real question we'll get into in a moment is how is that caused, right? Like what's actually causing that neuron to die? And so just taking another step back to the substantia nigra, down in that basal ganglia area of the brain, you see here, this is sort of what's happening. In a normal neuron, the electrical impulse travels down, it produces a bunch of dopamine, which is received by the postsynaptic neuron, and then the signal travels on. In someone with Parkinson's, what's happening, if you look here, there's very little dopamine being produced. So that means very little is being absorbed, right? And that's really what's happening. That's the root cause here of Parkinson's. So in a second ago, we were talking about, okay, if we understand what's actually happening with the dopamine, well, the question then becomes, what is causing that healthy neuron to essentially die or degenerate? There's a very specific protein called it's called alpha-synuclein. Its primary responsibility is to help regulate neurotransmitter release. One second, let me close this. Excuse me. Alpha-synuclein is its primary responsibility is to help regulate neurotransmitter release, which is this case is dopamine, right? And so this alpha-synuclein must fold a very specific way in order for it to get broken down. If it doesn't fold in that correct way, what happens is it can't be broken down and toxic aggregates are produced. Now, let's walk through this process one time so we all see very clearly what's happening here. You have this healthy neuron, you have this alpha synuclein protein, right? What happens through physical stress, through mutation, through all these different causes we talked about, pesticides, stress, genetic stuff, it could be a variety of things. What happens is this protein folds incorrectly. So think of it like it's meant to fold to the right, and instead it folds to the left. Well, what happens when it folds to the left is you're unable to break it down. It's unable to be degraded. And the result of that is protein aggregates start to build up in the area around these neurons, which were once healthy. Well, when these protein aggregates build up, it creates a toxic environment which kills the neuron itself. When that neuron dies, you have things like cancer, you have abnormal inflammation, and most importantly to Parkinson's, you have a major decrease in the amount of dopamine produced, right? So that's what's really happening. This alpha synuclein protein is folding the wrong way. Because it folds the wrong way, you have an aggregate, an accumulation of it, and that accumulation is toxic to the neuron. Once the neuron dies, no dopamine is produced. You can see up here in this pathway, if it's folded correctly, the protein is degraded correctly, and you retain a healthy neuron with a healthy function, preserve tissue in the area. So it's not a very complex process. I mean, it is, of course, but when you look at it sort of from layman's terms, you see it's a very straightforward thing that's happening, that this protein is really folding incorrectly and it's causing a toxic environment. There's also metaphysical causes, and I want to just pause real quick to talk about this one because when people hear metaphysical, sometimes people tune out because they're in this world where science rules everything. But you have to remember that the scientific method is limited to what it can quantify, right? And so to exclude things that aren't scientifically proven, if you want to live your life in that way, if you want to live your life in a way that's totally fine, my advice is if you're looking for holistic treatments, sometimes you're going to have to look outside of the scientific method and use common sense. And what I mean by that is quantum physics has proven that everything is energy, right? We all know this. We all agree with this. It's a fact. We know this now. So when we're talking about metaphysical causes, what we're really talking about is something down more on this quantum, this energetic level. It's not necessarily spooky woo-woo nonsense. It's this is science as well too. It's just not able to be controlled in a setting yet, right? And so one of the metaphysical causes of Parkinson's is rigidity and control issues. And I'll read this word for word: a tendency towards perfectionism, rigidity, or an inability to let go, manifesting as physical stiffness. Now, if you just think of this idea of um, an inability to let go, or this idea of perfectionism, the one person we served with Parkinson's ever, this person came to us, and when working with them in the psycho-spiritual journey, which we'll talk about in a moment, what came up was they realized that they always believed that they had to be perfect in everything they did, but yet they also had this belief that nothing was perfect. And so you have these conflicting beliefs that cause this stiffness, this like frozen inability to perform the functions that you want to do naturally. Doesn't that sound a lot like what happens when dopamine stops being produced? You try to pick up a pencil or something on the ground, a water bottle, and you just physically can't. And so when we're talking about these metaphysical causes, what we're really talking about is the law of correspondence that says, as above, so below, as below, so above. And the law of correspondence is made or designed specifically to help us make an inference about the unknown by knowing something about the known. An example I gave in a previous lecture was when you lift weights, your muscles are going to tear, right? And they're going to repair and get stronger. That's something we know through science, testing, kinesiology, all this kind of stuff. So to take the law of correspondence, we could then say, because when you lift weights on the level of the muscle, you have these tears. When you do something similar to lifting weights on the energetic level, like working with psychedelics, you could also make the inference that your energetic body, your energetic muscles will tear, your chakras, right? And we had a lecture on that before, talking about the validity of that. Another one is suppressed self-expression. So just think about, again, the symptoms of Parkinson's. There's a video out there. Some people did a case study on Parkinson's with a gentleman named Patient D, I think it was. And this man was unable to smile, right? That is a manifestation of suppressed self-expression, right? Imagine if your child is performing on stage and you want to clap, but you can't. That suppressed form of self-expression, how many times has that happened before in your life before you had the symptoms of Parkinson's? Right. And so these metaphysical causes are important to investigate because sometimes if you can really touch the root of these things, the cascading effects can be reversed if it hasn't been too much damage in the system already. This is why Iboga is so powerful, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And again, going to these metaphysical stuff, there's this energy technique that I'm trained in that I really love because they take a scientific approach towards it. And in their system, they have this 11 chakra system. The first thing you'll notice, every chakra isn't just a color like they tell you. It's just not the case. There are multiple colors. There's also 11 major chakras. But in this specific modality, which has a protocol, which we'll explore later, to cure Parkinson's, um, they say that what's really happening is in healthy individuals, the prana is flowing from the base of the spine up this middle column to these upper energy centers. Specifically with things like Parkinson's, what's happening is the flow is clogged. Dirty disease energy clogs the basic chakra down here, the spine and solar plexus chakra, disrupting the energy flow. So basically, you have a block down here, so no energy is making it up to the top system. It sounds a lot like you have a neurodegeneration occurring, so no dopamine is making it to where it needs to go. As above, so below, as below, so above, right? So just something to keep in mind. We'll talk about this more later. So, diagnosis, there's no specific test for Parkinson's because many of the symptoms overlap with other neurodegenerative disorders. However, it can be diagnosed. You can see it from DAT scans, which are dopamine transporter scans, basically looking to see the amount of dopamine inside of the system. But there's no direct test for Parkinson's. In addition to that, there's no actual cure for Parkinson's. And going back to the millions of people living with this, I mean, think about that. You are basically just like SOL in a lot of cases. You can treat it, but you can't cure it. Physiotherapy helps, speech and language therapy helps, medication, levodopa is a dopamine antagonist. And we're going to talk about that when we get into the science of Iboga. But in essence, the issue with levodopa is that studies show that over time it stops working, its efficacy starts to fade, leaving people literally hopeless. And like right here, it says symptom management only. And so a potential treatment for it. And I say a potential treatment because, again, there's no quote unquote scientific study showing this. But again, we will get into the science. I'll be showing the white papers and the research and going into the nitty gritty of why there's a opportunity here to talk about Iboga as a potential treatment. And I will go back and just say the one person we did ever serve with Parkinson's, I didn't know about all this science at the time. What I will say though is that this person did report having regressed symptoms that sort of took a step back in terms of how severe they were, and over time they came back. And so that sort of speaks to the ongoing therapeutic practice and treatment. So yeah, I just want to name that. And so for people who don't know what Iboga is a plant that grows in Central Africa, mainly the areas of Gabon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon, and it's a sacrament held by the Bwiti people, who are the indigenous people of Gabon. And on the left is a picture of my wife at her initiation in Africa, where she was initiated into a women's tradition of the Bwiti called the Mabanji tradition. And I just want to name too, we have a nonprofit called Sacred Roots Foundation. The website is www.sacredrootsfoundation.com. And what we do is we do restoration projects in Gabon. We have one we did where we helped teach them beekeeping. There's a man out there who's a master beekeeper, and so we paid him basically to go to the village and teach them how to cultivate their own honey for self-sufficiency. And then right now we're working on two other projects. One is to rebuild the women's village my wife attended. What beautiful, beautiful woman named Mama Toto. The village is run down. I mean, there's a few foundations, but no real walls. And then we're doing another one called Smile Gabon, basically where the children out there are dying because of things in the States that we take for granted, like cavities. A cavity is an infection, right? And what's happening is it gets so severe, it gets into the bloodstream, and these kids are dying from blood infection. And so just for small nominal fees like $80, you can save a lot of lives out there. So if you find yourself at the end of the year wanting to donate, trying to get yourself under a tax bracket, please go to our website and donate to one of those funds. I promise you the money goes a long way. We literally don't keep anything. We fund it. We fund the nonprofits behind the scenes from all of our retreat work, right? And so, yeah, just know that it's going to a good cause. But Ibogaine and Iboga, if people don't know, Ibogaine is one specific alkaloid in the Iboga tree. Most Iboga, if you take it, you'll find it's about 8% Ibogaine. In the picture right here on the right is of Iboga. It's literally just tree bark. It's natural that comes, and these are the fruits right here. So the first route for treatment, why this might work as a potential treatment, is these things called GDNF and BDNF proteins. So a GDNF protein is a glial cell line derived neurotropic factor. A BDNF protein is a brain derived neurotropic factor, and an NGF is a nerve growth factor. I want to talk about the GDNF specifically for this presentation because something very fascinating about them. So when you are between the ages of 0 and 3, this GDNF amount inside of your brain and your body is at an all-time high. And the reason why is because they're directly responsible for the development of your neurological system, right? So your nervous system, your brain, your spinal cord, your GDNF proteins are directly responsible for that. If you think of your brain and nervous system as like a brand new building someone's trying to construct, you could think of the GDNF proteins as the construction workers who are doing all the labor. Yeah, that's the easy way to sort of frame them. What is so fascinating about this is that after the age of 3, this number starts to taper off in terms of your GDNF count. The reason why is because you've already learned the majority of things you're meant to learn in your life. You learn how to walk, how to talk, who's safe, what's not safe. There's so many things that we take for granted now that we were learned in our formative years that are just with us now, right? Like I can stand up and I can juggle and I can do all these things, but you learn these basic movements and the foundational forming of the brain happens in these young age. This is why people spend so much time sort of going back into childhood and looking into certain events because there is a line for that, right? Because it's the development of the brain. What's so fascinating about working with Iboga is that when you ingest Iboga, your GDNF count is going to be at an all-time high, and that's accounting for weight, right? And so what you're really talking about is a complete flush of the brain of these very vital GDNF proteins that do so much to restore your brain. Specifically in brain regions like the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, and the substantia nigra. And if you remember specifically, that substantia nigra area is the main place where those dopamine producing neurons exist. And so what we're really seeing with this sort of approach from Iboga and how it helps is these GDNF upregulation in those two brain regions literally support the survival of these dopaminergic neurons, right? And the regeneration. And so if you remember, we have these toxic aggregates that come from these alpha synuclein proteins. These toxic aggregates build up in there, causing a toxic environment, which kills the neurons. These DNF sort of repair them and bring them back to life and restore them. And so, on one front, this is the primary way in which you can assist people with Parkinson's, right? Now, as these neurons redevelop or they're regenerated, the electrical impulse can make it across, which we'll talk about next. The dopamine can make it from one side of the neuron to the next, and that signal can make it down to the muscle, right? And so you're seeing right here one direct way in which Iboga will affect in a positive way individuals with Parkinson's. The next one to jump into is the myelination. They did a study where they basically injected a bunch of rats with, I think it was morphine, and they studied how that affected the myelination of their neurons, right? And if you remember down here, the myelination is this fatty substance that coats the neurons, right? It's what keeps it insulated. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that when the nucleus of your neuron sends an electrical impulse down the axon, right? That electrical impulse, I did say this, without the myelination will get lost. But with the myelination, with strong, good myelination, really good insulation, it actually travels from point A to point B 100 times faster. These little gaps in between the myelination are called the nodes of Ranvier. And what happens when you have really good myelination is the electrical impulse, they say it almost jumps to this spot. It travels so fast that it jumps to the next spot. It travels so fast that it jumps to the next spot. It travels so fast that it jumps to the next spot, making a 100 times faster trip. Imagine if you're driving your car going somewhere that's 50 miles, let's say, and you're going 50 miles an hour. That's going to take you 1 hour. Now you put yourself going 100 times faster, 500 miles an hour. That's going to take you, what is that, a minute? I mean, that's literally what's happening right here, right? So you have to just understand what's really occurring in this is that you're literally speeding up the chemical or the electrical impulses throughout your body. This is why in Gabon, if you notice out there, the Bwiti men and women will use Iboga when they go hunting and things like that, because it literally makes you more aware. Your entire system from the repeated use of Iboga becomes more alert, more aware because your myelination is there. And so this is one of the benefits I talk to people. Sometimes people are like, well, I don't have anything going on with me physically. How will Iboga help me? And I'll tell them about this, and they're usually pretty interested. So what Iboga is doing in this study, they found that it's actually repairing, it's remyelinating the neurons, right? So as this degeneration happens, the myelination dies. One of the ways the dopamine produces the electrical signal never makes it there. And so what's happening when this myelination starts to repair is the electrical signal has a chance to even make it down there in the first place. Now, the reason I put atypical Parkinson's here, if you remember, atypical Parkinson's is one that has, it's sort of linked to a variety of neurodegenerative disorders. And in a lot of cases, the myelination is primarily responsible for these neurodegenerative disorders. So you're talking about a very holistic approach to treatment of very different conditions in here with this myelination factor. And then this CN pass and the MBP, these are, in essence, what they are markers used to measure the myelination in the brain. And so this is how they sort of drew the correlation. They said, wow, these markers have sort of increased. So we know that there's increased myelination in the brain. And it's also something to mention too, is that this study showed that the BDNF proteins repaired white matter, which improves the motor and cognitive network connectivity. You can think of the white matter, a beautiful way I was taught this, the white matter is sort of like the internet of the brain, right? It's like the ways, the medium in which things communicate. Yeah. And so very, very important is this factor of the myelination for Parkinson's. And then the last one, which is probably the most single fascinating thing that I have personally found about Iboga since I've been working with this for the last 5 years, is this, and I'm going to read the article title for you here in a second because the title is a little long, but it really speaks volumes. Pharmacological chaperones of the dopamine transporter rescue dopamine transporter deficiency syndrome. And so many people feel like me, like, what the hell does that mean? Basically, what's happening here is that they found that Ibogaine has the capacity to correct the misfolding of the alpha synuclein protein. And that's what they mean when they're saying Ibogaine acts as a pharmacological chaperone, right? If you remember, this alpha synuclein folds incorrectly. That creates toxic aggregates. This creates a toxic environment by the neuron. As the neuron degenerates, dopamine stops being produced, right? Which has its effects that we see on the surface level. Ibogaine goes in and it chaperones the correct folding of that alpha synuclein protein, which then allows it to be broken down, which ensures that there are no toxic aggregates, which then keeps the life of the neuron there. And if you just think about that, what this is really implying, this is really at the core of where I see the most efficacy in terms of studying this as a treatment for Parkinson's. Obviously, you'd have to have sustained use and all that kind of stuff. But what you're really talking about here is an opportunity to increase the dopamine transport surface expression, right? And so Ibogaine promotes the successful transport of dopamine transport to the cell membrane, enhancing its ability to regulate dopamine levels effectively. In other words, it allows the dopamine to actually be there. And so this is a very important piece for those suffering with Parkinson's. And if you are someone who is, I would take this presentation to your doctor and talk about it and see what they say. I'd be very curious to know. And if you're open to sharing with me, I'd love to know what they say. If they just write it off, if they say go for it, if they're know of any studies taking place, it'd be a very fascinating thing to look into. Of course, it's important that we also talk about another aspect of Iboga. Um, this is written in all the other research papers, so I didn't put a specific paper to this, but I can show you countless ones that talk about this. But resetting the neurological pathways. Iboga has a very interesting ability to promote neuroplasticity through the GDNF proteins, rebalance the brain chemistry. It does that by binding to a variety of receptors, which I'll talk about in a second. And this brings a whole new sort of reset to life, reducing the psychosomatic roots of disease. One fascinating thing about Iboga that you won't really find anywhere else, uh, not anywhere else I've ever seen, at least from a single molecule. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about Ibogaine right now, which actually converts to Neuroibogaine. For example, if you have ever sat or worked with psilocybin, psilocybin isn't the chemical that actually binds to your 5-HT2A receptor in your brain. It's actually psilocin. So when you ingest psilocybin, it goes through a process of dephosphorylation, and that becomes psilocin. Psilocin is what actually binds to that 5-HT2A receptor in your brain. In the same way, ibogaine, which is the topic of study, is converted into neuroibogaine. I think there's an enzyme called the CPY2D6 or something along those lines. There's a specific enzyme in the liver that converts ibogaine into neuroibogaine. This is also why we do liver panels for people who have had alcoholism before we allow them to sit with the wood, because we have to make sure that your liver's healthy, right, to metabolize it. So ibogaine is converted to neuroibogaine. Neuroibogaine is the one that binds to a whole suite of receptors inside of your brain like nothing else does, literally working as a full spectrum medicine. It does bind to the dopamine uh, transport system, and that means it works as a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, right? And just to make sure we all understand what that means, I'm going to go back real quick to the slide here. So a dopamine reuptake inhibitor is similar to an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So what's happening is, let's say this is your dopamine, it's being produced, right? So now in this junction between the neurons, you have all these free floating dopamine molecules. As you can see here, some will be bound to the postsynaptic neuron, which then touches the nucleus or gets the nucleus involved and sends another impulse down, right? Another message. Some of these dopamines are not absorbed, right? They're not taken in on these receptor side, excuse me. And so what happens is their reuptake. They're absorbed back by this presynaptic neuron and they're stored up here, right? Uh, SSRI, a reuptake inhibitor, what it does is it stops this presynaptic neuron from reuptaking, from reabsorbing the dopamine, which keeps it inside of this junction, which allows more opportunities for it to bind. That's why an SSRI improves your mood. You have serotonin, comes here, some of it binds, some of it wants to be absorbed, but this stops the reabsorption, the reuptake. It keeps more serotonin in your system, more serotonin binds, and that elevates your mood, right? And so Ibogaine, in addition to everything else we just discussed, let me find my slide, acts as a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. That's amazing if you think about it. As I said, it also binds to the serotonin receptor system. That's why it has the mood benefits, acting as an SSRI. If you ever heard of Ibogaine getting people clean of addiction, especially with opiates, this is why, because it also binds to the opiate receptor systems. Another beautiful fact, if you ever worked with ketamine, ketamine binds to the glutamate receptor system. That's where you get that dissociative quality. Iboga also binds to the glutamate receptor system. Another fascinating one is the sigma 1 and sigma 2 receptors. Sigma 2 specifically have been linked to various forms of cancer. We're actually going to present this in a few, maybe in January's community call. We'll go into the cancer topic of this. But mutations in the sigma 2 actually result in certain types of cancer. Well, what's fascinating is that Iboga, the same way it sort of chaperones the folding of the alpha synuclein, it also works by helping these sigma 2 receptors. And we're going to talk about in the next call. So it actually has anti-cancerous properties. And then another one is the acetylcholine receptor system it binds to, and those are the nicotine receptors. That's why people who have nicotine addictions find a lot of sovereignty after working with Iboga. And I said this last call, but I had two kids recently. I served two younger kids who started when they were like 15, and both of them are completely free of nicotine now and like the biggest advocates of Iboga ever. It's kind of funny. So the metaphysical aspect of how Iboga helps, yeah, deep introspection, restoring emotional flow and spiritual realignment. I just want to take a second to talk about this for a moment. So um, this is obviously a staged photo. We would never record during a ceremony. But this is how a psycho-spiritual journey looks when you are working with Iboga with us. And so the way it works basically is you'll be laying down on the mat with your mask on. I'd be sitting up next to you, and I'm guiding you on a psycho-spiritual journey. The easiest way to explain it is imagine if you are in lucid REM sleep, right? And so you have one of those dreams where you have control, like full control. You can pick things up, you can do whatever. I'm sure you might have had that maybe a few times in your life. An Iboga journey, when we're doing the psycho-spiritual journey, is almost identical to that. It's just a different framework in which you're navigating. In the dream world, you're navigating the dream framework, which is created by the mind itself. In the Iboga realm, you're in a different type of framework, which is partially your mind, more your unconscious, and then a part of the Iboga spirit that sort of creates this world as you navigate it. Yeah, it's really beautiful. And so what I do in these journeys is I take people on these voyages, and what we're doing is this deep introspection, restoring emotional flow. We're doing physical healings. We're doing all sorts of stuff. And so I'll share one quick story about one guy that I think sort of articulates this very clearly. We had this gentleman come to the retreat a few years ago, really, really sweet man. And he, when he was young, walked in on his father who committed suicide, which is just like horrific to even try to contemplate, right? The father shot himself, and the boy is the one who walked in after he heard the gunshot. And so this guy was suicidal his whole life, tons of issues, didn't really get into drugs, but he had other vices he used to cope with his pain. And so during the psychospiritual journey, he was in a deep visionary state. And I asked him specifically, I said, hey, I want you to ask the medicine what's going to happen if you decide to commit suicide, because he was still suicidal. And it showed him sort of at his own funeral. And he was looking around, and he got this impression that his son became a drug addict to deal with the emotional pain from him killing himself in the same way that he got into his own vices from his dad killing himself. Um, and so after he processed all that, I asked him to do the same thing, but ask the medicine to show you what's your life like if you don't kill yourself. And he saw himself staying in a hospital room holding his grandchild and just broke into tears. And this gave him a reason to live, right? This next generation of being that he wouldn't be able to see, that might not even come into this world if he decided to kill himself. And so that's the power of these journeys, right? It's essentially the Iboga working through me, through you, to help you. And so that's another way Iboga can help in sort of the psychospiritual component. And then going back to this pranic healing talk I was giving you guys about, these trainings are amazing. You can find them anywhere. I highly suggest taking them, even if you just want the information. But in level two, the advanced pranic healing, which is more focused on using different colored pranas, there is an actual protocol to treat Parkinson's disease. It's on page 265 through 267 of the advanced pranic healing book. But there is a physical protocol that you can follow over and over again that is designed to treat Parkinson's. And if you remember from that initial slide, what we were talking about was energy moving from the base of the spine up to the top of the head. And if you look here, what we're really doing is first, we're starting cleansing energy centers. We're removing dirty red energy, disease energy from the chakras, spine, and surrounding areas. You're going to do that from the solar plexus, the ajna, the back head, right? So the same thing, the same areas that were blocked, you're basically cleansing them, and then you're energizing those centers. And they say that if you do this over time, what's going to happen is the energy flow is going to come back, the life of those neurons is going to come back, and the cascading effect's going to happen. Remember, as above, so below, as below, so above. And again, for anybody who doesn't believe in this stuff, that's totally fine. Um, I actually didn't believe in these things for a long time until I experienced them enough times where I stopped needing to believe because I had experienced. That's why I always say experience transcends fate. So if you don't believe it, I don't blame you. My best advice to you, if you're that type of person, is go try it for yourself and allow the experience to be your teacher. And that's the end of our presentation today. I want to thank all of you for attending. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to email us. You can email us at info@runewisdom, or you can replace info with my name, Troy, and they'll email me directly. And if you're interested in sort of sitting with us or experiencing the wood in some setting, then visit our website and submit an inquiry, and you'll be prompted to set up a call with me, and we'll talk directly one-on-one about your needs. So without further ado, again, thank you for the time. And again, if anyone knows anyone with Parkinson's specifically who is interested in participating in a case study that we could actually do with them, please introduce us. Obviously, the treatments would be free in exchange for their time and their trust. And yeah, we would really love to start putting together case studies and more evidence that shows that this can be a treatment of a valuable treatment proposition, especially as things change in the States with RFK being appointed ahead of health, basically. There could be an opportunity in a few years where things like this become legal, and it'd be nice to have some groundwork already started before we do larger scale clinical assessments. And if any of you know this, know me, my job really with Iboga, I feel, is to have it be held under a medical license, right? And we do that through clinical trials and sort of all this stuff. There's very rigorous testing that have to come involved with that, but that's fine. The point is once you can get it under a medical license, there's people who normally would be opposed to it that would now be open to it. And that for me is really just about another act of service about what can I do to help this be more accessible to more people? I can help bring a medical license under it. So what we're doing with our project in the Caribbean is essentially the goal is to turn into a fully licensed medical center. At the end of the day, it's not necessarily meant to be a psychospiritual retreat. That's not really where we see that place going. We want to have that in addition to this. So there's something for both people, but we think what's really of primary importance is an actual licensed medical facility that's buying medicine through the Nicoya protocol, that's sort of following all the guidelines and in alignment with Africa and doing things the right way and really setting that as our foundation. And then from that, blossoming out a more psychospiritual retreat, which we actually won't even call it a retreat. It'll be more of an ashram where you come to study with Iboga sort of in a dieta setting. So that's what we're doing. Again, if you need any stuff from us, just reach out. We're here for everybody. Bye, see y'all. I need to figure out how to stop this recording.